You're not going anywhere like that. The Alpha King snarled as the Omega walked out in white. Magic thrummed invisibly through the air, a silent pulse that had both protected and cursed the land for centuries. In this kingdom, the Alpha King reigned, a figure of absolute power whose voice could command the winds and whose eyes could silence a room. Yet even he was not immune to unease when the gates of his fortress opened and a figure appeared, draped in white. The Omega had come. She walked slowly across the outer courtyard, her gown brushing against the cold stones. It was not a gown of frivolous beauty. It was a statement pure and deliberate. White in a land of shadows, it announced courage, defiance, and a light that refused to be dimmed. Courtiers and soldiers alike paused, staring, whispers trailing after her like ghosts. No one had ever walked in white through the fortress gates without permission, and certainly not under the gaze of the Alpha King. From the highest balcony the Alpha watched. His expression was carved from stone, yet inside, a storm brewed. He had heard of her approach, of course. Rumors traveled fast through Durnhall's corridors. They said she was fearless, untouched by fear or magic, marked by an ancient prophecy that even he could not ignore. They said the kingdom itself would tremble if the Omega and he were ever bound together. He had thought of her as a mere symbol until now, a distant curiosity, but seeing her move across his courtyard, pale and unwavering, awakened something dangerous in him. Something he did not wish to name. "You are not going anywhere like that," the Alpha King growled, his voice carrying across the stones. It was a sound that could split the air and shake the ground, and yet it held a trembling undercurrent he would never admit. "Turn back, now." The Omega paused, her gaze lifting to meet his. Fear flickered in her chest, yes, but it did not rule her steps. She did not bow, she did not falter. The white of her gown glimmered faintly in the dim light, a beacon of something the Alpha had long forgotten, hope or perhaps defiance. "I go where I must," she said softly but firmly. Her voice did not shake, even though her heart raced like a drum in her chest. "And I will not turn back for any king, not even for you." A silence fell. The wind seemed to still, the magic in the air bracing for collision. The Alpha's dark eyes narrowed. He descended from the balcony, each step echoing like a drumbeat. Soldiers instinctively fell back, understanding that this was not a scene for interference. This was a confrontation of fates, of wills, and perhaps of hearts. "You do not understand what you are tempting," the Alpha King said, his voice lower now, edged with warning. "This fortress is not merely stone and gate. It is my command, and my command bends all life to my will. You cannot walk here unchallenged." "I understand more than you think," the Omega replied. She lifted her chin, her eyes not leaving his. "I understand fear. I understand power, and I understand what it means to stand alone when everyone expects you to bow." Her words were simple, yet each one struck him harder than any sword could. There was no arrogance, only clarity, and in that clarity the Alpha King felt a pang he could not place. Anger, admiration, or something far more unsettling. He stopped a few paces from her, the shadows clinging to him like a living cloak. He towered over her, yet there was a tension between them, a pull, a silent recognition that they were bound together in a way neither could yet fully comprehend. The fortress itself seemed to lean closer, as if listening, as if waiting for the first move in a dance long foretold. "Step back," the Alpha ordered, his voice rougher now, "or I will move you myself." The Omega shook her head, her hair catching faintly in the pale light. "I step only forward," she said, almost whispering. Her hand brushed the hem of her gown, where a faint shimmer ran like the trace of a spell. She had not known exactly why she wore white, or why she felt compelled to cross the courtyard, but instinct guided her, and instinct rarely lied. The Alpha King felt his breath catch. He had faced enemies who wielded magic like storms, generals who plotted like serpents, even spirits that had haunted the mountains for centuries, but none had moved him like this. Her courage, her defiance, her quiet certainty, it called to something buried deep within him, something he had long denied. He wanted to crush her, to bend her will, yet the thought of doing so filled him with a hollow ache he could not name. It was terrifying because he recognized it immediately. He had never felt anything like this before. "Why do you persist?" he asked, softer this time, almost curiously. "Why risk everything for a walk in white?" "Because some things are worth the risk," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, yet beneath it lay the tremor of a heartbeat that carried both fear and courage. "Because some things are more than crowns and power." For a moment, neither moved. The Alpha King's shadow fell across her, long and dark, and she did not flinch. Her gaze did not waver, and it was that unwavering gaze that made him realize the truth. This was no ordinary Omega, no mere subject to be subdued. She carried something within her, a force, a light, a fate, that would challenge him and perhaps even save him from the darkness he had wrapped around himself like armor. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the courtyard, scattering leaves and dust. The Omega's gown fluttered, catching the light and casting a soft glow around her figure. The Alpha King, despite himself, stepped closer. He was no longer snarling, no longer issuing commands. He was studying her as one might study a storm or a comet, with awe and apprehension intertwined. "You should not have come," he said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You have no idea what you are tempting. This land is cursed. My kingdom is cursed. And you," he paused, swallowing, "you walk here as if nothing can touch you." "I know what I face," she said, "and I know who I face, but I do not fear you." "Not truly." Her words echoed in the courtyard, carried by the wind, and for the first time in centuries, the Alpha King felt the pulse of his own heart quicken, not with anger, but with something else, something dangerous and uncharted. For a moment they stood like statues, two forces in a world of shadow, neither yielding, both aware that the next word, the next movement, could change everything. And then, almost instinctively, the Omega moved. She approached an ancient altar in the center of the courtyard, a relic from a time when the kingdom was unbroken and light had not yet been shadowed. The stones were carved with runes that glowed faintly beneath her touch. She reached out, her hand brushing against the surface. The pulse of magic beneath her fingers stirred, quickened, and the air seemed to hum louder, as if aware of the prophecy being set in motion. The Alpha King's breath caught, a low growl escaping his lips. He had thought he controlled everything, that no force could breach his fortress without his consent. But now, seeing her touch the relic, seeing the quiet defiance in her eyes, he understood that some forces could not be commanded. Some forces could only be confronted. "You do not understand," he said again, though the words felt hollow even to him. "This is dangerous. I should," his hand clenched, shadows flickering along the edges of his sleeve. "I should stop you." The Omega turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "And yet you do not," she said softly. "You watch, you see, you feel it too." A silence fell, thick as the fog that clung to the courtyard walls. He could not move, though every instinct screamed at him to do so. She could not move, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. And yet in that shared stillness, a thread began to form, fragile, trembling, but real. The Alpha King's shadow shifted closer, and he dropped to one knee, not in submission, not in reverence, but in recognition. Recognition of what was coming, of a force he could neither crush nor flee. The Omega's hand hovered over the altar, the magic thrumming stronger beneath her touch. And in that heartbeat of stillness, a silent promise was made. Their fates were bound, whether they liked it or not. The wind carried a whisper through the courtyard, almost a warning. The path ahead would be perilous, filled with trials that could break them or forge them anew. The Alpha King's eyes met hers, dark and stormy, and he whispered more to himself than to her, "I will not let this happen, not to you." But she only smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and determination. "Then watch," she said, stepping fully to the altar, "and see what I am willing to risk for what is right." And as her hand pressed against the relic, the runes flared, casting light across the courtyard, and the first tremor of magic rolled through the kingdom, unseen but felt. The Alpha King stood, torn between fury and fascination, understanding fully that the game had begun, and that neither of them would walk away unchanged. The kingdom held its breath. The courtyard remained bathed in the strange glow of the altar's runes long after the Omega withdrew her hand. The magical pulse had not faded. It lingered like a heartbeat, subtle yet persistent. The Alpha King stood motionless, staring at the relic and then at her, his stormy eyes clouded with confusion. He had ruled Durnhall for decades, feared by his enemies, respected even by spirits, yet never had he faced a force like this calm, unwavering courage in a human soul. The Omega stepped back, her white gown flowing with an ethereal grace. She did not speak, yet the quiet of her presence carried more weight than any shout or command. The Alpha King finally broke the silence, his voice low, resonant, yet tinged with something he did not recognize: admiration, and perhaps a shadow of longing. "You walked into my fortress," he said, his words cutting through the twilight air, "and touched a relic older than my crown. Do you understand what you have done?" "I understand enough," she replied. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "I have touched what is right. And I have felt the pulse of what could be if the kingdom finds courage again." He narrowed his eyes, studying her as one might study a blade before drawing it. "And yet you expect me to let you walk freely after what you have provoked." "I expect nothing of you," she said, and the words struck him like a sudden wind. "I only walk for myself and for what I must do." The Alpha King's hands clenched at his sides. His pride, his control, his very identity as ruler demanded that he seize her, command her, bend her to the rules of his fortress. Yet every instinct in him hesitated. This Omega, she was not afraid, and that alone was a threat more dangerous than armies or curses. He moved closer, the black stone beneath his boots echoing each step. "You do not know the danger you court," he warned, his voice deeper now, almost a growl. "The relic you touched is bound to ancient powers, powers you cannot control." The Omega did not flinch. "Then perhaps you should teach me," she said, her gaze meeting his. "Or perhaps you should trust me." Trust. The word struck him like a dagger. He had not trusted anyone in centuries, not his generals, not his council, not even the spirits that whispered secrets through the fortress walls. And yet, here she stood, daring him, challenging him, asking for something he did not know if he could give. For hours they spoke, sometimes in words, sometimes in silence, each moment heavy with unspoken understanding. The Alpha King showed her the halls of the fortress, each corridor lined with enchanted mirrors that reflected not only appearance but intention. The mirrors revealed the truths people often hid, and yet even the mirrors could not capture the Omega's resolve. Where shadows fell, she seemed to glow with subtle courage, and the Alpha King realized something unsettling. She saw him, truly saw him, in ways no one else ever had. They reached a chamber deep within the fortress, a room carved from obsidian and protected by layers of enchantment. Here, the Alpha King could contain her, not in chains or walls, but in safety. Dangerous creatures prowled the night, drawn to the pulse of the relic and the aura of the Omega. He knew that outside the fortress, she would be vulnerable. "You will stay here," he said firmly, yet there was a tremor beneath the command, an acknowledgement that this was not punishment but protection. "Until I understand what you have awakened." The Omega bowed her head slightly, recognizing the authority in his words, yet she did not falter. "I will stay," she said, "but only as long as I am needed, and only until the truth is found." Days passed. Within the chamber, the Alpha King and the Omega began a delicate dance of words and glances, each moment revealing a deeper layer of their characters. He was domineering and sharp, yet she saw the vulnerability beneath the armor, the sleepless nights, the weight of responsibility, the haunting dreams of a kingdom in shadow. She noticed the way he lingered near books and scrolls, studying forbidden magic, and the way his hands trembled slightly when confronted by forces he could not command. She, in turn, revealed her own strength. She had lived in the shadows, but she was not shaped by fear. Her courage came from knowing what was right and standing for it, even if it meant standing alone. She had faced whispers of prophecy and ancient threats, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded attention without demanding it. The Alpha King, despite himself, began to be drawn to her. It was not desire in the common sense, but fascination. He saw in her a mirror of what he had long buried: hope, resilience, and the courage to face what others would flee. And yet, he remained aware of the danger. She could awaken forces that might destroy the kingdom, or perhaps even him. One night, the shadows shifted in the chamber, and the Alpha King found himself seated beside her as she examined a map of the kingdom. "The relic is not just a tool," she said quietly, tracing the runes with her finger. "It is a key to change everything if it is used wisely." He studied her, the candlelight reflecting in his dark eyes. "And if it is used foolishly?" he asked, almost challenging her, almost daring her to answer. "Then the consequences will fall on me," she said simply. "But I will not stand by while fear decides the fate of the kingdom." Her words struck him harder than any blade. He knew the weight of fear, the paralysis that it brought. He had ruled with fear to maintain control, yet she dared to walk unafraid into its shadow. In that moment, he realized that power without courage was hollow, and that courage without guidance could be reckless. Days turned into nights filled with quiet conversations and mutual discoveries. He learned her thoughts, her fears, her dreams. She learned his burdens, his regrets, his longing for redemption. They shared stories of loss and survival, of choices made and consequences endured. And each story, each word, drew them closer in ways neither fully understood. But the world beyond the fortress did not remain idle. Rumors of the Omega's defiance spread like wildfire through Durnhall. Allies and enemies alike watched, curious and fearful. Shadow beasts stirred in the forest surrounding the kingdom, sensing the pulse of magic she had awakened. The Alpha King could not allow her to face such threats alone, and yet the knowledge of what was coming filled him with dread. One evening, as the moon rose high above the fortress, casting silver light across the courtyard, a sudden commotion shattered the quiet. A dark force had breached the outer walls, a creature of shadow and malice, born from the darkest corners of the kingdom's ancient curses. Its eyes glowed with hunger and its form shifted, a blur of claws and smoke. The Alpha King acted without hesitation. He stepped between the creature and the Omega, summoning shadows to rise from the floor, bending them into walls of defense. The Omega's eyes widened, not in fear but in awe. She had known he was powerful, but to see him move so swiftly, so decisively, revealed another truth. He would risk himself before allowing harm to come to her. The creature roared and the fortress trembled. Shadows collided with shadows, magic against magic, and the Omega felt a strange pull, a connection to the Alpha King beyond fear, beyond reason. She reached out instinctively, brushing her hand against the air where his energy flowed, and in that touch she sensed his vulnerability, his unspoken care, and the unguarded heart beneath the armor. Together they fought, not as master and subject, but as two forces united against a common threat. Each move, each spell, each heartbeat synchronized in a rhythm that neither had expected. And as the creature finally dissolved into smoke, the Alpha King turned to her, his expression dark yet softened, shadowed yet unbroken. "You are reckless," he said, his voice low and edged with both anger and something else, something warmer, more dangerous. "And you are protective," she replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Perhaps that is not so terrible." The moment hung between them, electric and delicate. Neither spoke for long, each aware that words could shatter what had begun to grow in silence. And yet the understanding was clear. They were bound together, not by choice, but by fate, by courage, and by forces neither could fully command. That night, as the fortress slept under the twilight sky, the Alpha King found himself watching the Omega as she rested, white gown catching the pale moonlight. Her defiance, her strength, her quiet bravery, it haunted him. He realized with a mixture of dread and fascination that she had awakened something inside him, a longing, a hope, a possibility that he had thought lost forever. And somewhere, deep within the fortress walls, the pulse of the relic throbbed, reminding them both that the path ahead would be dangerous, that the forces they had stirred would not rest, and that their destinies were now intertwined in ways neither could yet foresee. The twilight sky over Durnhall shifted as the Alpha King and the Omega rode beyond the fortress walls. The night was thick with mist, and the forest surrounding the kingdom stretched like a dark sea, ancient and alive. Every tree seemed to watch them, every shadow seemed to whisper secrets of a time before kings and curses, before crowns and thrones. The Omega rode with a steady grace, her white gown tucked to allow movement, the faint glow of the relic's magic pulsing beneath her touch. The Alpha King rode beside her, his armor black and shining faintly under the dim light, eyes scanning the shadows. Every so often he would glance at her, noting the courage that radiated from her despite the perilous journey. She was small, human, yet her presence felt vast, as if the kingdom itself had taken shape around her defiance. "Do you feel it?" she asked quietly, her voice almost lost in the whispering wind. "The forest, it is alive, it watches everything." He did not answer immediately. He had felt it before, in dreams and in long nights of restless vigilance. The forest was older than the fortress, older than the kings, older than the magic that had shaped Durnhall. It was not malevolent, not exactly, but it demanded respect. "Yes," he said finally, "and it knows you. It recognizes the pulse of the relic, and perhaps it recognizes your courage." The Omega's eyes widened slightly. "Then it knows more than I do." She adjusted her grip on the reins, sensing that the forest's magic was subtly guiding them, nudging them towards something she could not yet understand. "We must follow it carefully." One wrong step. She did not finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air. One mistake could awaken forces neither of them could face alone. The Alpha King nodded, though his expression remained unreadable. He had faced monsters born of shadows, armies that moved like tides, and curses older than memory. Yet there was something uniquely unsettling about this journey. He was not merely protecting her from the dangers of the forest. He was discovering that his own heart and mind were caught in its web. They rode in silence for a while, the mist thickening, the trees looming like dark sentinels. Then the forest opened into a clearing, where silver moonlight touched a circle of standing stones, ancient and covered with runes. The air here felt different, heavier with the weight of prophecy and the pulse of magic. This was the place the oracle had spoken of in whispers, the place where destiny could be confronted and perhaps reshaped. The Alpha King dismounted first, moving with a predator's grace. He studied the stones, noting the faint shimmer of ancient enchantments. "This is no ordinary circle," he said. "These runes, they are alive. They will test us." The Omega stepped forward, her bare hands brushing the mossy stones. She felt the energy thrumming beneath her fingers, a rhythm that mirrored her own heartbeat. "Then we face it together," she said simply, and there was no hesitation in her tone. The Alpha King's eyes met hers. There was a flicker of something he did not wish to name, pride, fear, and something dangerously close to admiration. "Together," he echoed. The moment they touched the circle, the runes flared, casting silver light that danced across their faces. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Shadows deepened, shapes forming at the edges of vision, whispers curling like smoke around them. The pulse of the relic beneath the Omega's hand responded, quickening with a rhythm that felt almost alive. A figure appeared within the circle, rising from the silver light, a spectral being, neither fully human nor entirely spirit. Its eyes were like molten silver, its voice a melody that carried through the clearing. "You who walk in defiance," it said, "you who carry courage and fate know this. The path ahead will demand choice, and the choice will demand sacrifice." The Omega stepped forward unafraid. "I understand," she said. "I will face what must be faced." The Alpha King's hand brushed lightly against her arm, a rare gesture of protection, yet it was more than that. It was recognition, acknowledgement, and an unspoken promise. "Do not speak so lightly of sacrifice," he warned. "Some forces will take more than courage can offer." The spectral figure inclined its head. "True, and yet some forces respond only to courage. The pulse you carry, the defiance you embody, may undo what centuries of shadow have wrought, or it may bind you in ways you cannot imagine." The words hung heavily, their meaning both warning and invitation. The Alpha King studied the Omega, noting the way her jaw was set, the determination in her eyes. She had not faltered, not even for a heartbeat, though the weight of prophecy pressed upon her. He realized with a jolt that she carried more than courage. She carried the possibility of redemption, not only for herself but for him and for the kingdom he had ruled with fear and shadows. "Why do you not fear?" he asked, his voice low. "You touch forces that could destroy you, that could undo everything I have built, and yet you walk forward as if it is nothing." The Omega looked at him, and for a brief moment her defenses softened. "I fear," she said quietly, "but fear is not the same as obedience. I choose courage because I must, I choose hope because I must, and I choose truth because the kingdom deserves it." The Alpha King's chest tightened. She spoke with a wisdom he had long thought lost to the world, and he felt the stirrings of something dangerous, an understanding that his role as Alpha, as ruler, was no longer enough to command the world. There were forces beyond power, beyond decree, beyond the fortress walls that demanded more than dominance. They demanded heart. The spectral figure shifted, the light of the runes reflecting in its molten eyes. "The test is simple yet cruel. You must confront what you fear most, and in confronting it, you must accept what is hidden in your hearts." The ground beneath their feet trembled and shadows pooled at the edges of the circle. From the darkness emerged forms born of memory, regret, and longing. The Alpha King saw visions of betrayals past, of friends and allies who had turned, of choices made in desperation. The Omega saw visions of those she had lost, those who had depended on her courage, and the weight of responsibility that had defined her life. Yet neither faltered. They moved through the visions together, side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, a silent reassurance that they were not alone. Each trial demanded courage, each shadow demanded understanding, each whisper demanded acknowledgement of what had been buried deep within them. When the visions finally receded, the circle fell silent. The spectral figure smiled faintly, as if satisfied. "You have passed the first test, but know this, the path ahead will demand more than courage. It will demand trust, and it will demand surrender to forces you cannot fully command." The Omega turned to the Alpha King, her eyes shining in the silver light. "I trust you," she said simply, "and I will follow as far as the path takes us." He studied her, feeling the weight of her words more than any prophecy. Trust was a fragile thing, easily broken, yet she offered it freely despite the dangers. He had spent centuries guarding himself against betrayal, against weakness, against the heart's unpredictable stirrings. Yet now he found himself unable to deny the truth. He trusted her too. Perhaps for the first time he trusted another entirely. The forest around them seemed to exhale, the mist swirling gently as if acknowledging the bond that had been formed. And yet, beyond the trees, a darkness waited, cunning, patient, and aware of the forces that had been awakened. It had watched their journey, observed their defiance, and now it prepared for the moment when courage alone would not be enough. As the Alpha King and the Omega mounted their horses and continued through the forest, the weight of destiny pressed upon them both. Each step carried them closer to the crossroads of fate, where prophecy, courage, and sacrifice would collide. They were no longer merely Alpha and Omega, ruler and defiant soul. They were two forces bound together by necessity, by choice, and by the unseen threads of destiny. And somewhere in the deeper shadows of the forest, eyes glowed with anticipation. The path ahead would test them, perhaps to their breaking points. The bonds of trust, the strength of courage, and the depth of heart would be challenged. And when that moment came, the choices they made would shape not only their lives, but the fate of Durnhall itself. The Alpha King glanced at the Omega, noting the soft glow of her determination. She rode with quiet grace, fearless yet aware, and he felt a surge of something unfamiliar, a desire to protect, to guide, and perhaps to surrender to what he had long denied within himself. The Omega looked back at him briefly, and their eyes met. No words were spoken, yet the connection was unmistakable. They were partners now, bound by defiance, by courage, and by the pulse of forces neither fully understood. And in that moment, the forest seemed to hum with quiet approval, as if acknowledging that a new chapter in Durnhall's history was beginning, one that would be written not by fear, but by courage and heart. The kingdom of Durnhall shivered under the weight of an unnatural twilight. The sky was a bruised purple, clouds swirling like smoke, and a wind carried whispers of unrest through the fortress and forest alike. The Alpha King and the Omega had returned, their journey through the forest behind them, but the trials were far from over. The pulse of the relic and the magic she had awakened had drawn more than just attention. It had awakened forces long dormant, forces that hungered for chaos, for the fall of the Alpha King, and for the Omega's defiance to be punished. They approached the fortress gates together. The walls were scarred, the stones darkened by black smoke and faint glimmers of enchanted fire. From the highest tower, sentries watched silently, their faces tense. The fortress, usually a symbol of dominance and control, now felt vulnerable, as though it sensed the coming storm. The Omega dismounted first, stepping onto the cobblestones, her white gown faintly glowing with the magic she had carried through the forest. "The people," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the empty courtyards and the distant shadows, "they need more than protection. They need hope." The Alpha King nodded, his jaw set, armor dark against the dim light. "Then we give it to them," he said, voice low but firm. "But first, we face what has been awakened." A rumble shook the fortress as the shadows from the forest surged forward. They took shape, twisted, monstrous reflections of past betrayals, creatures formed from the regrets and failures of centuries. Each figure moved with intent, drawn by the pulse of the relic and the defiance of the Omega. The Alpha King stepped in front of her, as always, his shadow stretching over her like a protective cloak. "Stay close," he commanded, yet there was no fear in his tone, only determination. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The Omega met his gaze, understanding the depth of his promise. "Together," she echoed. The first shadow lunged, a creature born of smoke and malice, eyes glowing like molten silver. The Alpha King moved with precision, bending the shadows of the fortress itself to his will, creating barriers and strikes that pushed the creature back. The Omega, despite her lack of formal training in combat, reached for the relic's pulse, guiding its energy outward. The light flared, striking the shadow with a brilliance that made the darkness shrink, retreat, and wail. But this was only the beginning. Shadows multiplied, merging into forms more terrifying, more cunning. They remembered the Alpha King's past, the betrayals he had endured, and they sought to unearth his darkest fears. Yet each time, the Omega's presence, her courage, and the pulse of the relic reminded him that fear was no longer the only force in his life. There was now defiance, there was hope, there was trust, and that was more powerful than any shadow. In the heart of the fortress, The main hall shattered under the weight of the oncoming darkness. The creatures pressed forward, their claws tearing through stone and magic alike. The Alpha King and the Omega stood back to back, their movements synchronized, each instinctively protecting the other. The glow of the relic flowed from her hands into his, their energy mingling, stronger together than apart. "You cannot face this alone," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Neither can I, but together we can shape what comes next." He grunted in agreement, bending the shadow around them into a protective circle. "Then let the world see the strength of courage and heart combined," he said, voice rising like a battle cry, resonating through the fortress walls. The shadows hesitated for a moment, almost as if recognizing the bond between them. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the largest and darkest figure emerged, towering above the others. It was the embodiment of every betrayal, every fear, every regret the Alpha King had carried for centuries. Its form shifted constantly, a writhing mass of shadows and memories, eyes glowing like the fires of the underworld. The Alpha King stepped forward, sword in hand, yet his movements were careful, controlled. He did not strike recklessly. "This is mine," he said, voice firm. "Every failure, every fear, every loss, I face it now and I will not run." The Omega stepped beside him, raising her hands, allowing the relic's pulse to surge outward, forming a shield of light. "And I stand with you," she said, her voice unwavering. "Not as a follower, but as a force of hope and courage." The shadow roared, a sound that shook the stones of the fortress and seemed to reverberate through the very heart of Durnhall. Yet the Alpha King and the Omega held their ground, their combined strength a beacon against the darkness. Step by step, they advanced, forcing the shadow to retreat, fragment by fragment, until the largest form faltered, then dissolved into nothing more than a whisper of mist. The silence that followed was profound, the fortress itself seeming to exhale. The danger had passed, but the cost had been heavy. Stones were broken, walls scorched, and magic had been spent beyond measure. Yet in the quiet aftermath, a new truth was revealed. They had faced not only external threats, but the fears and regrets within themselves, and emerged stronger for it. The Alpha King lowered his sword, breathing heavily, and looked at the Omega. She was standing tall, the relic's light dimming but still present, her eyes bright with triumph and relief. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of the battle giving way to something gentler, something more intimate. "You were magnificent," he said quietly, almost a whisper, though the walls echoed it like a proclamation. He paused, searching for words that could capture the depth of what he felt. "I never imagined courage like yours existed." The Omega smiled faintly, a mixture of fatigue and quiet pride. "And I never imagined trust like yours," she replied. "Not blind trust, not obedience, but the kind that strengthens, that protects, that allows courage to grow." For the first time in centuries, the Alpha King felt a lightness he could not name. The fortress, once a symbol of isolation and command, now felt like a place where heart and courage could exist side by side with power. He realized that leadership alone, even the might of an alpha, was insufficient to guide a kingdom. It required more. It required understanding, compassion, and partnership. The Omega reached for his hand, and he did not hesitate. Their fingers intertwined, a simple gesture, yet one that carried the weight of fate, trust, and shared triumph. In that touch, the pulse of the relic flowed stronger than ever, connecting them not only to each other but to the very essence of the kingdom they had saved. Beyond the fortress walls, the first hints of true dawn touched the horizon. Twilight, once permanent over Durnhall, gave way to soft light, breaking through the haze of shadow and magic. The people who had hidden in fear began to emerge, witnessing the fortress scarred but standing, the Alpha King and the Omega at its center, united and unwavering. "Do you see?" the Omega said softly, her gaze sweeping over the recovering kingdom. "Light is always possible, even after the longest shadow. Courage and heart, they endure. The Alpha King nodded, his dark eyes reflecting both the trials they had faced and the promise of what was to come. And together, he said, voice strong, we endure. Not as ruler and subject, but as partners. Not as king and defiance, but as Alpha and Omega, bound by choice, courage, and trust. The fortress walls seemed to glow faintly, as if acknowledging the truth of his words. The magic that had once enforced obedience now shimmered with possibility, bending not through fear but through hope. And in that glow, the Alpha King realized that he was no longer alone, that the weight of centuries could be shared, and that even the darkest shadows could be met with courage and heart. The Omega looked up at him, eyes bright with quiet certainty. We have faced darkness, she said, and we have not been broken, and neither will the kingdom. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, a gesture both tender and protective. You walked in white, he said softly, and now the world will never forget it. For a moment the kingdom itself seemed to listen, the whispers of magic and prophecy fading into a calm, almost reverent silence. The Alpha King and the Omega stood together, the scars of battle around them, yet unbroken. They had faced fear, shadows, and prophecy, and in doing so had discovered something stronger than either: hope, courage, and the power of trust. The wind carried faint echoes of the past, but also the promise of a future written not by fear, not by power alone, but by heart. And as the first full light of dawn broke across Durnhall, the Alpha King and the Omega walked side by side, ready to face whatever trials might come together.